Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin, a huge thanks for your support. If you love chilling true crime stories, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss a mystery. Now, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's haunting tale. Some mysteries defy explanation. Some stories strain the very fabric of what we believe is possible. This is one of those stories. Elellanar Matthews was just 24 years old when she vanished without a trace from her home in Oakage, Connecticut, on a crisp autumn morning in 1937. A devoted mother to her 4-year-old daughter, Margaret, and wife to her husband James, Elellanar was described by everyone who knew her as kind, reliable, and utterly devoted to her family. She had grown up in Oakage herself, the daughter of the local pharmacist, and had married her high school sweetheart just 5 years earlier. Their modest 2-story colonial home on Maple Street was always immaculate, with curtains that Elellanar had sewn herself and a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. On that fateful morning, everything seemed normal. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, and no goodbye note. Her purse was gone, but her wedding ring and jewelry remained in a small wooden box on her dresser. Even her coat still hung by the door, despite the autumn chill. It was as if she had stepped out of her life and into thin air. The search for Elellanar Matthews would become one of the most extensive in Oakage history. Her photograph was circulated far and wide, even appearing in newspapers as far away as Boston and New York. Yet, despite all the efforts, the trail went cold. Elellanar Matthews became a ghost, her memory a whispered tragedy, a cautionary tale. Elellanar Matthews had been the heartbeat of the Matthews household. Her family was everything to her. James Matthews, her husband, was a quiet, reliable man who worked as a banker in the small town of Oakage. He had known Elellanar since high school, and their love had blossomed into a marriage full of promise and dreams. Together, they built a modest life filled with simple joys, a neatly kept home, family dinners, and evenings spent tending to the garden that was a reflection of Elellanar's nurturing spirit. Margaret Matthews, their only daughter, was the light of Elellanar's life. At just 4 years old, Margaret was a curious and lively child, often found running through the house, her laughter echoing through the rooms. Elellanar was devoted to her, sewing clothes for her, preparing homemade lunches, and ensuring her daughter had every comfort. The bond between mother and daughter was undeniable, a special connection that seemed unbreakable. Their home, a quaint 2-story colonial on Maple Street, was always filled with warmth and love. Elellanar had an eye for detail, and the house was always immaculate, from the carefully arranged furniture to the homemade curtains she had sewn herself. The garden, bursting with vibrant flowers, became the talk of the neighborhood, a symbol of her love for beauty and nature. It was in this tranquil, picture-perfect world that the unimaginable happened. The morning Elellanar disappeared, everything seemed normal. James had left for work early as usual. Elellanar had made breakfast, packed Margaret's lunch, and set the house in order. She wore a navy blue dress with white polka dots, a light cardigan, and her favorite brown Oxford shoes. It was a typical morning in Oakage, nothing out of the ordinary to suggest that the world was about to change forever. But as the hours passed and Elellanar didn't return, the reality of the situation began to sink in. James, returning from work, found the house undisturbed, the breakfast dishes cleaned and put away, and Margaret's lunch neatly packed. But his wife was gone, leaving no trace behind. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, nothing missing from the house except Elellanar herself. Margaret, only 4 years old, couldn't comprehend the weight of the loss. She had been too young to understand that her mother might never return. But every day, she would wait by the window, looking for her mother to walk up the path to the front door. Every evening, her father would carry her to bed, explaining that sometimes people go away and we don't know when they'll come back. But Margaret's mother never did return. James, heartbroken but determined, kept the hope alive. He left a lamp burning in the window every night, believing, against all odds, that Elellanar would walk through the door someday. He never remarried, never allowed the thought of moving on to cross his mind. In his heart, Elellanar was still out there, and someday she would come home. As the years went by, James raised Margaret on his own. He worked tirelessly as a clockmaker, but when he was home, he cooked, cleaned, and cared for his daughter. He braided her hair, helped with homework, and told her stories of her mother. The pain of losing Elellanar never faded, but James carried on with an unwavering faith that someday his wife would come back. The morning of October 24th, 1937, was like any other in Oakage, Connecticut, a town where the days drifted by slowly, marked by the rhythms of small-town life. The trees had started shedding their leaves, carpeting the streets in gold and crimson. The crisp autumn air was filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the sound of the wind rustling through the branches was the only noise that disturbed the stillness of the morning. For Elellanar Matthews, it seemed like just another peaceful start to the day. She had risen early, as usual, and prepared breakfast for her husband, James, and their daughter, Margaret. It was a simple breakfast: oatmeal with cinnamon and raisins for Margaret, coffee and toast for James. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread, the warm fragrance filling the home. Afterward, Elellanar prepared Margaret's lunch, wrapping up a ham sandwich, an apple, and 2 molasses cookies in a cloth napkin. She placed the lunch neatly on the kitchen counter, ready for Margaret to take to school. The dishes from breakfast were cleaned, and the radio was softly playing in the background, tuned to an orchestral music program that seemed to provide the perfect soundtrack to the morning routine. Elellanar, dressed in her navy blue dress with white polka dots and a light cardigan, had finished her chores and was about to head out to get the morning mail. Her coat hung by the door, and she slipped on her favorite brown Oxford shoes as she made her way toward the front porch. But something about this morning was different. There was a sense that the tranquility of the house, so carefully cultivated by Elellanar, was about to be shattered. James Matthews left for work as usual, and everything seemed as it should. The house was immaculate, the garden vibrant, and Elellanar's presence filled every corner. She kissed Margaret goodbye, promising to return soon, and then walked out into the chilly autumn morning. What happened next is still a mystery that has never been solved. Elellanar was last seen walking toward the front door, leaving the house without her purse or coat. No one saw her after that. It was as though she had simply disappeared from existence, leaving no trace behind. There was no evidence of a struggle, no sign that she had been taken, and no indication that she had left of her own free will. James Matthews returned home that evening to find everything in its usual place, but Elellanar was gone. The house was undisturbed. Her coat still hung by the door, the kitchen tidy, and the radio still playing the same soothing music. Margaret's lunch remained on the counter, untouched. The only thing missing was Elellanar herself. For a moment, James thought she might have gone out to run an errand or take a walk. But as the hours passed and Elellanar didn't return, anxiety began to creep in. He rushed to check the neighborhood, asking neighbors if they had seen her, but no one had. There was no sign of her in the streets or on the main road. She hadn't boarded a bus, nor was there any sign that she had left town. Panic set in. James immediately contacted the local police, and a search began. The small town of Oakage, usually quiet and safe, was thrown into disarray. Neighbors formed search parties, combing the woods surrounding the Matthews home, scouring the small lake on the outskirts of town, and asking anyone who might have seen something unusual. But despite their best efforts, no trace of Elellanar was found. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the search for Elellanar Matthews turned into a mystery that captivated the town. Her photograph was circulated in newspapers across the state, appearing as far away as New York and Boston. There were rumors, of course, whispers of Elellanar running away with another man, of possible mental instability, or even darker theories suggesting foul play. But none of these theories held up. There was no evidence to support any of them. The police investigation turned up nothing. No one had seen her, no one had heard anything, and there were no clues to suggest what had happened. The months dragged on, and the local newspaper, once filled with daily updates, began to run only occasional mentions of the case. The headlines that once blared, "Local Mother Vanishes," began to fade into the background, replaced by other stories, other tragedies. Elellanar Matthews became a ghost, a name spoken of in hushed tones, a cautionary tale to warn children to always be careful, always stay close to home. But to her family, especially to James and little Margaret, the pain never faded. Every day without Elellanar felt like an eternity. James Matthews continued his search in his own quiet way. Every night, he left a lamp burning in the window, convinced that she would return. His faith in her love for him and their daughter, kept him going. He never remarried, never even considered it. He couldn't. How could he when Elellanar might walk through the door any minute? But as the years passed, the hope began to wane. Elellanar Matthews was officially declared missing, her case filed away in the dusty archives of the Oakage Police Department. To the rest of the world, she was just another mystery. But to James, to Margaret, and to everyone who had known her, Elellanar's disappearance was something that would never be forgotten. The days following Elellanar's disappearance were filled with frantic activity. The local police, led by Sheriff Thomas Landry, launched an immediate investigation into the mystery. Oakage, a town not accustomed to such tragedies, became a hotbed of speculation and rumor. Everyone seemed to have their own theory about what happened to Elellanar Matthews, but none could answer the single question that haunted the Matthews family. Where did she go? Sheriff Landry, who had known the Matthews family for years, personally took charge of the case. He questioned neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have had a glimpse of Elellanar on that fateful morning. The town's milkman, a man who had delivered to the Matthews house just hours before her disappearance, was one of the first people interviewed. He reported nothing unusual, no sign of Elellanar in the yard, no odd behavior. He said he hadn't seen her since he had dropped off the morning delivery. The search parties, made up of neighbors and townsfolk, scoured the surrounding woods, the lake, and even the nearby train tracks. They examined every possible lead, from the woods behind the Matthews home to local bus routes. The search became all-consuming, with little sleep and few breaks, as the community rallied together in an effort to bring Elellanar back. James Matthews, desperate to find his wife, offered a substantial reward for any information leading to her whereabouts. The amount, nearly all of their savings, was posted in newspapers throughout the state. The promise of a generous payout spurred many to step forward with their theories and potential sightings. But as the weeks turned into months, all of these leads proved to be dead ends. As the weeks passed, the theories surrounding Elellanar's disappearance became more bizarre. Some whispered that she had run off with another man, perhaps an affair she had been hiding. The idea that Elellanar had simply left her family, despite her loving nature, was hard to swallow, but it was a possibility some couldn't shake. Others suggested that she might have been suffering from mental instability. Perhaps the pressures of motherhood, combined with the stresses of her small-town life, had overwhelmed her. The idea that she had walked away from everything she knew, her husband, her daughter, and the life she had worked so hard to build, seemed to some like the only logical explanation. But none of these theories explained the strange circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Why had she left behind her wedding ring, her jewelry, and her coat? Why had she left no note, no goodbye? The details of the morning, the immaculate state of the house, the untouched breakfast dishes, and Margaret's neatly packed lunch, seemed to contradict any theory of voluntary departure. It was as though Elellanar had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind a life she had meticulously crafted, as if nothing had ever been amiss. James Matthews refused to believe that his wife had run away. His faith in her was unwavering. He could not accept the idea that Elellanar had abandoned their daughter, Margaret, and their life together. He would not accept it. He continued to push the investigation forward, working tirelessly with Sheriff Landry, hoping for a breakthrough, a piece of evidence that might bring Elellanar home. But no such breakthrough came. The case grew cold. The weeks turned to months and the months to years. Each passing day felt like a dagger to James's heart, but he never let go of the hope that his wife would one day return. As time went on, the investigation became a series of dead ends. There was no sign of Elellanar in the town, and no one had seen her leave Oakage. No bus tickets had been purchased in her name. No train schedules showed her boarding a car. No one had seen her anywhere in the state. The case seemed to fade into obscurity, and the local newspaper, which had once published daily updates, began to run only occasional mentions of the missing woman. The search, which had once been filled with such fervor, now seemed to be an afterthought, a distant memory of a tragedy that had never been solved. Sheriff Landry, though personally invested in the case, was forced to admit that they had no solid leads. As the investigation faltered, the theories became even more fantastical. Some townspeople, perhaps out of desperation or a desire for closure, began to whisper that Elellanar had been taken, abducted by someone, perhaps a stranger passing through town. But if that were true, why was there no sign of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and no ransom demand? The most unsettling theory, however, was the possibility that James himself might have been involved. Some questioned his behavior during the investigation. He was described as having an unshakable calm, almost too calm for a man whose wife had disappeared under such mysterious circumstances. However, no evidence was ever found to support these theories, and James's grief, though deep and unspoken, was undeniable. The Matthews family was not the only one affected by Elellanar's disappearance. Neighbors who had once known the Matthews family well began to speak in hushed tones, unsure of what had really happened. The local gossip mill churned out a steady stream of rumors, each more outrageous than the last. But none of these rumors, no matter how sensational, ever led to the truth. And so, Elellanar Matthews remained missing, her disappearance a deep, unsettling mystery that would never fully be explained. As the years passed, the case was eventually closed. The search for Elellanar Matthews became one of Oakage's forgotten tragedies, a case filed away in the dusty archives of the police department, never to be solved. To the rest of the world, she was just another name lost to time, another person whose story remained untold. But to James and Margaret, Elellanar was never forgotten. Her absence haunted them every day, and the questions that remained unanswered would linger in their hearts for years to come. Margaret Matthews grew up in a home where love was abundant, but the shadow of her mother's disappearance loomed over everything. At just 4 years old, Margaret couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of the loss. How could she? She was a child, and to her, the absence of Elellanar, the only mother she had ever known, was an unspoken ache that gnawed at her heart. In the early years, Margaret would wait by the window every evening, hoping for the sound of her mother's footsteps on the gravel path, the familiar sight of Elellanar's figure coming up the walkway. She couldn't understand why her mother hadn't come home. Every night, her father, James, would carry her to bed, telling her the same thing. Sometimes people go away, and we don't know when they'll come back. It was a gentle explanation, meant to soothe, but it did little to ease the confusion and longing Margaret felt. To her young mind, the idea of forever was incomprehensible. She would ask again and again when her mother would return, her voice filled with hope. But the answer remained the same, and with each passing day, the pain deepened. As Margaret grew older, she became more aware of the void left by her mother's absence. She watched as her classmates laughed and played with their mothers, attended mother-daughter tea parties, and celebrated birthdays with both parents by their side. It was then that she realized that her life would never be like theirs. There would be no school dances with her mother by her side, no comforting presence when she was sick, no advice on navigating adolescence. Instead, there was only her father, a man who had to play the roles of both parents, and while he did his best, there was an undeniable absence in his heart as well. James Matthews, despite his profound grief, did everything he could for Margaret. He was a man of routine, a man who believed in discipline and consistency. He taught her how to ride a bike, how to sew a button on a shirt, and how to cook simple meals. He braided her hair, helped her with her schoolwork, and even took her to the occasional school dance, though it was always a somber affair. Margaret could see how deeply her father missed Elellanar. He kept his pain hidden, buried beneath layers of practicality and strength. But every night, without fail, he would leave a lamp burning in the window, a silent vigil for a wife who might one day return. But the years wore on, and life continued to unfold without the presence of Elellanar. Margaret's birthday came and went, and each year, James would give her the same answer when she asked about her mother. "She'll come back when she's ready, Margaret. She loves you and she'll come home." But as Margaret grew older, she began to understand that the world doesn't always give us the answers we long for, and sometimes people don't come back. The reality of her mother's disappearance settled in, and with it came an overwhelming sense of abandonment. In school, Margaret became the subject of quiet whispers and pitying glances. Other children, not understanding the complexities of her situation, would often ask about her mother. The well-meaning but naive questions like, "Why don't you have a mom?" or "When's your mom coming back?" would echo in her mind long after the conversations had ended. As a child, it was one thing to wait for a mother who had gone missing. It was another thing entirely to face the world as a girl without one. In an attempt to fill the emptiness, Margaret immersed herself in books. She sought solace in stories of strong women, of mothers who were always there, guiding and protecting their children. These women were comforting to her, but they also reminded her of what she had lost. She excelled in her studies, and though she had friends, there was always a distance she couldn't close. No one truly understood what it was like to live in the shadow of a mother's absence. James never remarried. He couldn't. He never even seemed to consider it. His love for Elellanar remained constant, unwavering, and in some ways, Margaret felt she was expected to carry that same loyalty. Though her father never said it outright, there was always the unspoken assumption that one day, Elellanar would come back, and they would all pick up where they had left off. But as the years passed, Margaret began to understand that life doesn't wait for the impossible to become possible. Despite everything, Margaret managed to create a life for herself. She went on to attend college, met a kind man named Robert, and eventually married him. But even as she built a new life, her mother's absence remained the constant ache in her chest. She would often find herself wondering what could have been. What kind of woman would her mother have become if she had never disappeared? What would she have been like as a grandmother? How much of herself did Margaret lose when her mother was taken from her? Through it all, Margaret continued to carry the story of her mother with her, as though the mystery of Elellanar's disappearance was a part of her own identity. And while she had found some peace in her adult life, there remained an undeniable longing, a need for answers that could never be fully satisfied. As the years passed, Margaret Matthews tried, as best as she could, to build a life for herself. She got married, had children of her own, and even became a teacher. Yet, there was always a part of her that remained a child, sitting by the window, waiting for her mother to return. The pain of that childhood loss never fully went away, and neither did the unanswered questions. What happened to Elellanar? Why did she leave, or worse, was she taken? As Margaret grew older, the need to find closure became all-consuming. In her early 20s, Margaret began the search for answers in earnest. She couldn't just live her life without understanding the truth. Her mother's disappearance had defined her entire existence, and she knew that until she found out what had really happened, she would never be free from it. The search was a heavy burden, one that she could never seem to shake, no matter how hard she tried. Her first attempt to dig deeper into the mystery came when she hired a private investigator. With the small inheritance from her maternal grandmother, she enlisted the help of a detective who specialized in cold cases. They spent months retracing the original investigation. They interviewed the same neighbors, checked every lead that had been pursued years ago, and followed up on every forgotten tip. But no new clues emerged. The trail was as cold as it had been all those years ago. Margaret refused to give up. She went through every police report, read every article published about her mother's case, and contacted anyone who might have known something. Over the years, she hired several investigators, none of whom were able to provide anything substantial. Each time she thought she was getting closer to the truth, something would collapse under the weight of contradictions or lack of evidence. The investigation was like a cruel dance. One step forward, 2 steps back. She started to question if she would ever find the answers she so desperately sought. In the 1960s, Margaret contacted the FBI, hoping that new forensic methods might uncover something that had been missed in the original investigation. They tested samples, searched for any physical evidence that might have been overlooked in the initial inquiry, but once again, there was nothing. The case remained as it always had been, unsolved, filled with rumors and wild theories, but lacking any solid proof. Margaret's hope for closure began to feel like an impossible dream, one that seemed farther away with each passing year. But Margaret didn't stop. She couldn't. In the 1980s, she appeared on a television program about unsolved disappearances. It was a national show that featured families looking for missing loved ones, hoping that someone, somewhere, might know something. The exposure was brief, and though it brought some fleeting attention to Elellanar's case, it ultimately led to nothing concrete. Yet, the search had become a part of Margaret. It was as though her life had become intertwined with the mystery of her mother's disappearance. The years weighed heavily on Margaret, and as she entered her 60s, the relentless pursuit of answers began to take its toll. Her children, now adults themselves, grew concerned about their mother's obsession with the past. They worried that the search had become an unhealthy fixation, one that would never give Margaret the peace she was seeking. They urged her to move on, to focus on her family and her life with them, rather than dwell on a tragedy that had happened so long ago. But Margaret couldn't let go. How could she, when there was so much left unanswered? Every time she tried to turn away from the search, something inside her pulled her back. She could never accept the idea of her mother vanishing into the unknown, never knowing what happened, never understanding the truth. It wasn't just about finding her mother anymore. It was about making sense of a life that had been altered irreparably by a single, unexplained event. Her family's concern for her grew as the years went by. Margaret's eldest son, Thomas, a psychiatrist, gently suggested that grief can manifest in unusual ways, especially in older age. He worried that his mother's obsession with the past was becoming unhealthy, something that might distort her sense of reality. Margaret's daughter, Catherine, practical and grounded, shared her brother's concerns, urging Margaret to let the mystery fade away. Margaret listened, but her heart refused to accept their advice. The search was more than a hobby. It was a mission, one that defined who she was. She felt a responsibility to the memory of her mother, and she couldn't let go until she had some kind of resolution. Even if it meant living with the uncertainty forever, she had to keep going. It wasn't until years later, when Margaret was in her late 70s, that something truly unexpected happened. A breakthrough she had never anticipated. It came in the form of a photograph. It was just a glimpse, a fleeting image that would change everything. But at the time, it was nothing more than a passing moment in the midst of a larger exhibition, one that Margaret was initially reluctant to attend. The photograph would lead her to a discovery so unbelievable that it would challenge everything she thought she knew about her mother's disappearance. It was a rainy Saturday in spring when Margaret Matthews found herself at an art gallery in New York City, something she never thought would happen in her 80s. Her granddaughter, Olivia, had invited her to attend the opening of a photography exhibition at her gallery. Margaret, always supportive but not particularly interested in modern art, agreed to go, though her mind was elsewhere. She had seen Olivia grow into an adult, a curator at a small art gallery, and had done her best to be a part of her life. But today, something was different. The gallery was brightly lit, the soft hum of conversation filling the air as patrons sipped champagne and marveled at the images. Olivia was busy explaining the artistic merits of each photograph, her passion for the work evident in her voice. Margaret nodded politely, occasionally glancing at the large black and white photographs hanging on the walls. They were striking, images of urban life, candid shots of people going about their business in the chaos of city streets. Olivia, noticing her grandmother's quiet demeanor, smiled and gestured toward the final section of the exhibition. "These last few are some of my favorites," she said. "They were all taken at Grand Central Terminal over the course of a single day. You'll love them." Margaret wasn't particularly interested in the modern photography style, but she followed Olivia toward the final section. The photographs were a stark contrast to the rest, raw and emotional, capturing the loneliness of the city's bustling crowds. Margaret stopped in front of one large photograph, staring at the scene before her. It was Grand Central Terminal, a place she had visited many times during her life. But something in this photograph caught her eye. Amid the busy commuters, tourists with cameras, and hurried travelers, there was a woman standing still. She was slightly off-center, her posture poised, but her face, a face that seemed strangely familiar. Margaret stepped closer to the photograph, her heart racing as she looked at the woman in the crowd. She had seen that face before. She would know it anywhere. It was Elellanar. For a moment, Margaret felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The champagne glass slipped from her hand, but she didn't even hear it shatter on the floor. All she could see was her mother's face, perfectly preserved, exactly as she remembered it from the photographs that had aged with her over the decades. The woman in the photograph was older now, wearing modern clothing, a black coat over a gray dress with a red scarf tied at her neck. But her face, her posture, even the way her hair was styled, was unmistakably Elellanar. The birthmark near her left eyebrow, the curve of her smile, the softness in her eyes, they were all there, untouched by time. It was impossible, yet there it was, staring back at her from a photograph taken only 6 months ago. Margaret stood frozen, her eyes locked on the woman in the photograph, unable to process what she was seeing. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Was this some sort of cruel joke? Could this be a case of mistaken identity? No. She knew it was her mother. The resemblance was too uncanny, too perfect. Olivia, who had been busy speaking with another gallery visitor, returned just as Margaret stood there, still staring at the image. She noticed her grandmother's pale face and rushed over. "Grandma, are you okay?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Margaret could barely speak. She pointed to the photograph, her finger trembling. "That's her. That's my mother." Olivia looked at the image and then back at her grandmother, confusion creeping across her face. "Grandma, are you sure? That can't be." But Margaret wasn't listening. She was too consumed by the impossible reality of what she had just discovered. The woman in the photograph wasn't just a passing resemblance. This was Elellanar Matthews, standing in the middle of Grand Central Terminal, looking just as she had in 1937, when she had disappeared without a trace. Margaret's mind raced, the room spinning around her. How could this be possible? How could her mother, who had vanished all those years ago, be alive and standing in a photograph taken only months ago? Olivia, noticing the shock in her grandmother's eyes, called over the photographer, Julian West, who had captured the image. He was a tall man with a beard, and his eyes were kind as he approached. When Margaret explained who she believed the woman in the photograph to be, he listened attentively, not dismissing her as some delusional old woman. Instead, he looked at the photograph and listened to her story, visibly moved by the connection Margaret had made. "I don't remember anyone specific from this shoot," Julian said, his voice calm. "This was taken during rush hour, and I was focused on capturing the general energy of the station. I didn't pay attention to individual faces, but if you say this is her, I believe you." He paused, thinking for a moment. "I can give you a high-resolution copy of the photograph. You're welcome to use it however you need." Margaret, still in disbelief, took the photograph from him, her hands shaking. She left the gallery that day with the image clutched tightly in her hands, her mind spinning with the possibilities. She had found her mother, or at least a version of her. But the questions that now swirled in her mind were overwhelming. How had Elellanar stayed the same? Why was she in New York? And most importantly, where had she been all these years? The photograph was only the beginning. After months of uncertainty, after decades of unanswered questions, Margaret Matthews finally felt a flicker of hope. Yet with that hope came a deep, overwhelming fear. Was this a sign that her mother had been alive all along, or was she simply grasping at the impossible? Margaret had lived with the pain of not knowing for so long. The possibility of having Elellanar back seemed too surreal to process. But the photo was undeniable. It was her mother, without question, frozen in time, unchanged. Margaret knew what she had to do. She had to find her mother, no matter the cost, no matter how extraordinary the circumstances. And so, she set out on a new mission. This time, not to search for clues, but to face the reality of what she might find. Her son, Michael, the only one of her children who believed in the possibility of the impossible, supported her decision. He was willing to entertain the idea, despite the fact that his siblings remained skeptical. Margaret's first step was to track down the photographer Julian West. He had given her the high-resolution image, but the real breakthrough came when he revealed a small detail. He had no recollection of the people in the photo, but there had been one detail he could remember. He had captured the photo at Grand Central Terminal during the rush hour, and one particular woman stood out to him because of her distinct, timeless appearance. He had no idea who she was, but something about her face lingered in his memory. West had offered to search through his other photographs from that day to see if the woman appeared again. He did, and in one of the subsequent images he found her again, standing in the same spot. After some investigation, West had uncovered a faint trace of her purchase: a one-way ticket to a small town in upstate New York, Millfield. Armed with the address from the ticket and West's photographic evidence, Margaret made the decision to visit the town herself. The journey was one of growing anticipation, a battle between hope and doubt. Could it really be her mother? Would she really find Elellanar after all this time? Or would it be another dead end? The town of Millfield, quaint and picturesque, felt like stepping back in time. Margaret and Michael arrived, both uncertain of what to expect. It was a place where everyone knew everyone's business, and strangers stood out. They visited the local diner, and there the waitress named Dorothy immediately recognized the woman in the photograph. "Oh, that's Elizabeth," she said without hesitation. "She moved here about 7 months ago. Keeps to herself mostly. Lives in the old Whitaker house on Elm Street." The name was familiar to Margaret. Elizabeth. Could it be? Was her mother now living under an assumed name? The questions raced through her mind, but she didn't want to get ahead of herself. The woman in the photograph might be someone else, or perhaps someone who just looked like Elellanar. But her heart was telling her something different. They drove to the house on Elm Street, a large Victorian home tucked away from the main road. It looked well-kept, with vibrant flower boxes and a well-maintained porch swing gently swaying in the breeze. The house seemed both timeless and modern, as though it were from another era but updated with some contemporary touches. Margaret couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had brought her here. As they approached the front door, Margaret's heart raced. Her palms were sweating, and she could feel the years of waiting, of searching, coming to a head. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorbell. But before she could make a move, the door opened. And there she was. Standing before her was a woman, beautiful, ageless, and unmistakably familiar. The same face Margaret had studied in photographs for decades. The high cheekbones, the warm hazel eyes, the soft curve of her smile. It was Elellanar. But there was something else too, something more difficult to put into words. This woman, though seemingly unchanged, had an aura of sadness, of regret, as though decades of loss had been etched into her soul. "Hello, Margaret," the woman said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle Connecticut accent that Margaret had known as a child. It was a voice she had longed to hear, but it sounded different now, laced with the weight of time. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Margaret stared at the woman who had been lost to her for so long, and Elellanar stood silently. Her eyes filled with recognition, and perhaps something more. A feeling of both fear and relief. How is this possible?" Margaret finally whispered, her voice breaking. You look the same. You've been gone for so long, and yet, it's you. I knew it was you." Elellanar took a step forward, her hands trembling as they reached out to Margaret. She looked at her daughter, eyes filled with tears. "I've been waiting for this moment," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd see you again. Not like this." Margaret stepped forward as well, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, what to feel. The reality of this moment was almost too much to bear. Her mother, the woman who had vanished without a trace, the woman she had spent her entire life searching for, was standing in front of her, young, unchanged, and alive. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered, shaking her head. "Where have you been? Why did you leave us?" Elellanar's face softened as she stepped aside, inviting Margaret into the home. "I'll tell you everything," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions flooding through her. "But it's a story that will take time to understand. It's not easy to explain. But I've lived through it all, Margaret. I've lived through all these years, and I've never stopped thinking about you and James." As they entered the house, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Margaret knew that everything was about to change, but she also knew that the truth, no matter how difficult to grasp, was finally within reach. The reunion was just the beginning of a long, complicated journey. A journey filled with painful revelations, but also with a sense of hope that had been lost for decades. As the evening light dimmed and the house settled into a quiet stillness, Margaret and Elellanar sat together in the cozy living room of the old Victorian home. Margaret's heart was heavy with questions, each one vying for attention, each one more pressing than the last. But above all, one question echoed in her mind, louder than the rest. "Why? Why did you leave us?" Elellanar, her face still youthful and familiar, sat across from her daughter, the weight of the decades between them pressing down on both of them. Her hands, though ageless, trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. Margaret sat still, her breath shallow, waiting for the answers she had longed for her entire life. "I know you must have so many questions," Elellanar began, her voice soft but steady, carrying the years of grief, fear, and sorrow she had lived through. "And I will answer them, but you have to understand the truth. It's not simple. It's not easy to explain." Margaret nodded, her eyes never leaving her mother. For so long, she had imagined this moment, what it would feel like to finally hear the truth. But now that she was here, sitting with Elellanar after all these years, it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Elellanar took a deep breath, her eyes flicking to the window where the last light of the day was fading. "It all started on that morning in 1937. I had no idea what was going to happen. Everything was normal, just like any other day. I prepared breakfast, packed Margaret's lunch, and went outside to get the mail. But what I found in that letter changed everything." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "A letter?" she whispered. "What did it say?" Elellanar's eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. The letter was postmarked from Boston, and it had no return address. Inside, there was an address in the city, and the instructions were clear. "Come alone, or your family will be in danger." It said that James had unknowingly become involved with dangerous people through his work at the bank, and if I didn't go to Boston to meet someone who could explain everything, it would be too late. Margaret could feel her breath catch in her throat. "And you went?" Elellanar nodded, her eyes shadowed by the weight of the memory. "I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I thought about telling James, but the letter made it clear that doing so would put him and you in even more danger. So I decided to go. I didn't take anything with me, just my purse, the clothes I was wearing, and a hope that I could get to the bottom of whatever this was. I thought I'd be back by dinner. I had no idea that would be the last time I would see you both." Margaret listened in silence, unable to speak as she processed her mother's words. The idea that Elellanar had left without a trace, thinking she would return soon, was both heartbreaking and incomprehensible. She had never imagined that her mother's disappearance had been tied to something so sinister, something that had been kept hidden from her family for so long. Elellanar continued, her voice faltering slightly. "I took the bus to Boston, and when I arrived at the address in the letter, it was a nondescript office building in the financial district. A man named Dr. Richards was waiting for me. He told me that I had been selected for a government research program, that my family's genetic background had made me a candidate for a study on longevity and immunity to disease. He said my maternal grandmother had been part of the program decades earlier, and now they believed I had inherited her genetic makeup." Margaret's head spun. What kind of program was this?" Elellanar's gaze drifted to the floor, and she sighed. "At first, I didn't believe him. It sounded ridiculous. But he had documents, details about our family that he couldn't have known unless it was true. They had been watching us for years, monitoring us. And when they realized I had this genetic trait, they contacted me. But it wasn't just about studying me. They needed my cooperation to continue their work. Margaret could hardly take it in. "So, you agreed to stay?" Elellanar nodded. "I did. I thought I would be back in a couple of days. I didn't understand the gravity of what I was getting into, but as soon as I agreed, everything changed. I was kept there, isolated, and told that if I didn't cooperate, they would harm James and you. They showed me surveillance photos of you playing in the yard, of James at work. They used these threats to manipulate me, and when I tried to leave, they kept me there against my will." The weight of Elellanar's words hung heavily in the room. Margaret's mind raced, trying to piece together the timeline, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. "They injected me with various compounds," Elellanar continued. "They took blood samples, ran tests I didn't understand. And after a year, something strange happened. I didn't age. I didn't get any older. It wasn't just a slow process, it stopped completely. My face stayed the same, my body stayed the same, and I couldn't explain it." Margaret was stunned, her mind reeling. "But why? Why didn't they let you go?" Elellanar's eyes filled with sorrow. "Because I was valuable to them. My condition, whatever it was, became their obsession. They wanted to understand it, to replicate it. They couldn't let me go. And every time I asked about you and James, they gave me small updates, but they kept me isolated. They kept me locked away for years, feeding me false information, telling me that you were fine, that James had moved on." Margaret could barely process the story, the revelation that her mother had been held captive for decades. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was sitting before her, as real as the pain in her heart. "I wasn't allowed to leave," Elellanar whispered, "until one day when a younger researcher, Dr. Eliza Chun, helped me escape. She gave me a new identity, a new name, Elizabeth Crane, and set me free. But I didn't know how to find you. The world had changed, and I was lost in it. I spent years searching for any trace of you, but everything I knew was gone." Margaret sat in stunned silence. The years of searching, the uncertainty, the pain, it all seemed to culminate in this one incredible truth. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She hadn't disappeared willingly. She had been taken, kept in a world that was both horrifying and unimaginable. "Now you know," Elellanar said softly, her eyes filled with tears. "Now you know the truth." The truth was finally out in the open, but the storm of emotions that followed Elellanar's revelation was far from over. Margaret, still reeling from the shock of hearing her mother's story, struggled to reconcile the woman before her with the idealized version of her mother she had carried all her life. The woman who had walked through the door, unchanged, young, and full of sorrow, was both familiar and utterly foreign to her. For days, Margaret wrestled with the implications of what Elellanar had shared. The life she had known, the questions that had haunted her for decades, had all been answered, but at what cost? The woman she had imagined as a tragic figure, a lost mother, had been locked away in a strange world, isolated and trapped by forces far beyond her control. Elellanar had been a prisoner, not of her own making, and now, Margaret had to face the reality that her mother's life had been taken from her in the most unimaginable way. But it wasn't just Margaret who was forced to confront this new reality. As the days passed, Margaret's children and grandchildren, who had known only the stories of their grandmother's disappearance, began to learn the truth. When Margaret returned home, she gathered them together, unsure of how to break the news, unsure of what their reactions would be. Her eldest son, James, named after his grandfather, was the first to speak. He stared at his mother for a long time, as though searching for some sign that this was all a dream, some clue that his grandmother's return was a figment of his imagination. He had heard the stories, had grown up with the mystery of his great-grandmother's disappearance, but to hear that she had returned, unchanged after all these years, was almost too much to bear. You're telling me that this is really her?" James asked, his voice thick with emotion. He studied Elellanar's face with a mix of disbelief and awe. It's impossible." Margaret nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's her, James. It's really her." James, still struggling to comprehend the situation, took a long step forward, slowly reaching out to touch Ellenar's hand. His fingers trembled slightly as he grasped her hand. I don't know what to say. This is unreal. How could this happen? How could she just disappear like that and then come back, unchanged? Elellanar, her own emotions simmering just below the surface, squeezed his hand gently. I wish I could explain it better, but I can't. I've lived through so many years, but I never forgot you. I never forgot Margaret. James stepped back, his mind racing as he tried to process the impossible truth. But what do we do now? What happens now? I have so many questions, but I don't even know where to start. Margaret, ever the steadying force in the family, placed a hand on James's shoulder. We figure this out together. We don't have all the answers, but we'll navigate this as a family. This is our chance to make up for lost time. Her youngest son, Michael, who had always been more open-minded, was the next to speak. He had grown up with the mystery of Elellanar's disappearance, and over the years, he had come to believe that his grandmother's disappearance was more than just an ordinary case. He had always felt, deep down, that there was more to the story than what they had been told. His calm acceptance of the situation surprised Margaret, but she found comfort in it. Life is full of mysteries, Mom, Michael said with a half-smile, his voice warm and understanding. If you say it's her, I believe you. I think we all just need to accept that some things are beyond explanation. This is one of those things. Catherine, Margaret's daughter, who had always been the most practical of the siblings, had a different reaction. Her mind raced, trying to analyze the situation logically, but the emotional weight of it all seemed almost too much to bear. She had grown up hearing the stories, but now that the reality had hit her, she felt overwhelmed. Wait a minute, Catherine said, her voice sharp with skepticism. So, you're telling me that she's been alive all this time? That she never aged? That she was locked away in some secret research facility for decades? Margaret nodded slowly, her voice filled with sorrow. Yes, that's what she's telling us. That's what happened. Catherine's face contorted with disbelief. This is beyond anything I can wrap my head around. How could they do this to her? To you, Mom? I don't know, Margaret replied, tears welling up in her eyes. But I do know that she's here now. We have to find a way to move forward together. Her grandchildren, who had never known the mystery that had defined Margaret's life, were eager to meet their great-grandmother, despite the confusion and disbelief. They were fascinated by Elellanar, asking her questions about her life in the 1930s, her memories of Margaret as a child, and what it had been like to live through the decades that had passed. For Elellanar, it was both heartbreaking and beautiful to share these moments with the young ones, knowing that the years lost could never be fully regained. As the family gathered around the dinner table that evening, there was a sense of tentative peace in the air. The reunion had been emotional, raw, and overwhelming, but in its wake, there was something more, a sense of hope that had been missing for so long. The family was no longer divided by the mystery of Elellanar's disappearance. They were united, and in the face of the impossible, they had found a new path forward. The reunion between Margaret and Elellanar, though filled with questions and revelations, marked the beginning of a new chapter. After decades of wondering, of longing, and of searching, the truth had finally come to light. But as Margaret sat quietly beside her mother, she realized that the answers, while satisfying in some ways, had created new questions. The pain of the past, of the lost years, couldn't be undone, and yet there was a quiet sense of peace that began to take root in her heart. As the days passed, Margaret, Elellanar, and the rest of the family began to rebuild what had been lost. There were no easy answers, no perfect solutions, but there was a bond that could never be severed, a thread that connected them across time, across pain, and across the uncharted spaces where their lives had been torn apart. For Margaret, the reunion wasn't about erasing the past, but about embracing the present and making the most of the time they now had together. Elellanar, for her part, began the slow process of reintegration. She had been living under a false identity for so long that the world she once knew had changed beyond recognition. The modern world was a far cry from the one she had left behind in 1937. But as she adjusted to her new life, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for her daughter's love, for the family that had never given up on her, and for the second chance to make up for the years lost. In the quiet moments, as Elellanar and Margaret sat together, they often spoke of the years they had missed, but always with an understanding that the past could not be changed. What mattered now was the future they would build together, as mother and daughter, as family united once more. The story of Elellanar Matthews, once a tragic mystery, was now one of survival, of resilience, and of the unbreakable bond of love. It was a story of a mother who had been taken away, and a daughter who had never stopped searching for her. And in the end, it was a story of hope, proving that sometimes, even the most impossible of journeys can lead to the greatest of reunions.